Hello students, and welcome to the first video of chapter 3. In this video we will be discussing the interacting spheres of culture. But before we start discussing the different spheres of culture, what exactly do we mean by spheres of culture? Culture can be discovered in various places or groups, and thus can form various groups or spheres of influence. So beside the country level, what other areas do you think can develop its own culture? Well, states can develop their own culture. For example, think about the unique culture that Texas has versus other states like California. Further, urban versus rural areas in a state will have different cultures. For example, think about the difference between Wichita Falls and Dallas, both being in Texas, both being fairly close, but very different culturally speaking. Groups of neighboring countries can also form subcultures of their own. They can share cultural elements, as can countries that had the same invaders, spoke the same language, practiced the same religion even. Even industries across various countries can share a common industry culture, such as the tech industry. You are probably already familiar with the fact that companies can create their own company-specific and company-wide culture that can exist in the same country, in the same company across different countries. Even functional groups can have norms by which they operate that make them different from other functional groups and thus have subcultures of their own. For example, think about the difference between finance versus HR. Very different philosophies and cultures are probably going to exist in each of these functional areas. Sometimes neighboring countries or countries that had the same invaders or spoke the same language, practiced the same religion, can all form regions. Regional culture refers to the difference within countries and similarity between other countries. For example, Scandinavian countries are a regional group of countries that share culture. It is important to recognize regional culture because we cannot assume that just because we're in one country, all regions will have the same culture. Doing business in Rome, for example, is very different than doing business in Milan. Further, recognizing regional cultures helps us understand why certain industries flourish in a certain region and why some trading partners may be perceived as more attractive than others. Let's look at some examples of different regions and why they developed. In the United States, there seems to be some very obvious differences between the East Coast, the West Coast, and the South. Why is this the case? This could perhaps be because the East Coast in the United States is where immigration in the US first began. It tends to be more densely populated and holds a seat of political power in this country. People often joke that in the East Coast, people live to be able to work or live to work. This is very different as opposed to the West Coast. As people look for new land and new frontiers, they started moving westward. Hence, the West Coast is newer, is less densely populated, except for certain regions in California, for example, and has more of a work-to-live ethic. They really like to enjoy the great outdoors. Of course, climate and the differences between East Coast cold climate and the West Coast warm climate could also influence why these regions have different cultures. Why is Southern culture so different from the East or the West Coast in the United States? Perhaps this has something to do with the cotton plantation history and the South's role in the Civil War in the US. Sometimes within the same country there is a north-south divide, creating different regions of culture. This seems to be the case in Portugal, where Lisbon and Porto seem to have slightly different regional cultures. This could also be because they seem to have differing influences, one being more of an Arabic influence, the other having more of a Celtic influence. Sometimes regional identity competes with national identity. For example, the Basques in Spain fought for their independence from Spain because they had such a strong subculture. This is also the case with the Quebecers in Canada. The Quebec region in Canada fought for their independence from Canada for a while. In India, 3 different states, Bombay, which is now known as Mumbai, Delhi, and Calcutta, all have very different cultures. Mumbai is the financial capital of India. Delhi, the seat of power and government in the country. Calcutta, on the other hand, is the head of the arts movement in India. Frankfurt, Berlin, and Bonn have similar differences in culture in Germany. Frankfurt being the financial capital, Berlin being the capital city, and Bonn being the head of arts and culture in Germany. Let us revisit for a second why regional culture matters. As we mentioned, regional culture can influence company choices. It can influence where a company chooses to set up foreign operations. Toyota, which is a Japanese company, has cultivated a country bumpkin image, and therefore wherever Toyota goes in the world, it always picks smaller rural areas to set up their operations. In the US, they went to Huntsville in Alabama and Buffalo in West Virginia. Michelin is a French company, but unlike other French companies, it chooses to not set up its headquarters in Paris. It sees itself as a rural-based company and has a culture that's secretive, austere, pragmatic. It does not recruit from the Grande École, which is the equivalent of the French Ivy League schools. When Michelin, the tire manufacturing company, decided to go international and came to the US, it set up operations in Greenville in South Carolina and Newfoundland in Canada, also rural areas. Sometimes particular regions within a country can create competitive advantages or disadvantages. For example, Silicon Valley has a high concentration of engineers in that region. And therefore, whenever a venture capitalist firm tries to set up a technology company, it is drawn to doing so in the Silicon Valley to be able to tap into the local know-how. Sometimes even weather, terrain, being part of a non-union state, the regional work ethic, all of these can be influential in terms of which region a company chooses to set up its operations. Tennessee is considered particularly attractive to Japanese companies because of similarities between Tennessee and parts in Japan, since it is in the same latitude as Tokyo and the climate and terrain are also similar. Regional culture can sometimes also have the opposite effect of being attractive. For example, in South America, because Brazil is one of the only Portuguese-speaking nations rather than Spanish-speaking nations, it stands out from the rest of the nations. And other parts of South America prefer not to do business with Brazil as much as they do with each other. Shared regional culture between Italy and France made Sweden a less attractive trading partner to Italy. When Electrolux, a Swedish company, acquired Zanussi, many Italians in particular, the Union, accused Zanussi of selling out to the Vikings of the North. They would have preferred alliance with the French group Thomson, who they perceived to have greater cultural similarity to them. Similarly, Denmark has stronger ties to other Nordic countries like Norway and Sweden than it does to the larger EU. It is said that Denmark would rather have a Scandinavian identity than being identified as Europeans. Different industries across the world also have different subcultures. Advertising, no matter where in the world, seems to share a common culture. But the culture in advertising is very different from the culture of banking. But what about the culture of banking versus the culture of insurance? Traditionally, insurance culture is more performance driven. There are clearer links between individual effort and company performance, and between individual reward and performance. Banking usually does not share the same aggressive sales orientation. However, this is now changing. The culture of an industry can also influence the success or failure of a business or merger, especially when that happens with another almost completely unrelated industry. Even in seemingly related industries, industrial cultures can present interesting challenges when trying to merge. For example, Novartis, which is a pharmaceutical company, bought Airwick, which is an air freshener company. But this merger was not a success. This is because Novartis had a perceived mission of saving the world, which did not seem to combine well with Airwick's mission of consumer products. Industry culture can be demonstrated using the example of high-tech industries. Here we are more likely to find large open spaces which encourage information exchange and interaction. Dress codes tend to be more relaxed, eccentric behavior tends to be more readily tolerated, it might even go unnoticed. This is because they're more focused on the technology or the product that they're creating. This is very different than banking, which tends to have more of a formal culture. Why are industry cultures different? Industry cultures are different because they have different task environments. This involves a difference in the nature of decision making, nature of products or services, degree of state intervention tends to be different. With regards to the nature of product or services, let's compare Unix versus pharma. In an attempt to come up with shared standards in the computer software industry, many rival companies started sharing information with each other. This need for information sharing in order to arrive at shared standards can be contrasted to other industries, such as pharmaceuticals, where secrecy is really key. Patents are the driver of competitive advantage in pharma, and letting your competitors know what you're working on can be akin to a death knell. One of the ways to understand why different industries have different cultures is to examine the nature of decision making in each industry. The way to do this is by placing the industry on where it falls in this 2x2 matrix. We can contrast industries depending on the degree of risk they take versus the speed of feedback or the amount of time it takes to know the consequences of a decision taken. In biotechnology, a large investment of resources, time, and money may be required without knowing for several years whether the investment is actually going to pay off or not. And this thus creates a bet your company type culture where the degree of risk is high and the speed of feedback is low, and thus risks have to be carefully assessed. In other industries, such as stocks and bond trading, the stakes are big. It's either high win or high loss, but the payoff is very quick. So while you have a high degree of risk, you also have a high degree of speed of feedback. This creates a macho type culture, which is aggressive and not risk averse. Sometimes the individual risk undertaken by an industry might be relatively low, but the speed of feedback could be very high. This would be the case in retailing, where the degree of risk of any one particular decision is relatively low. This is what is known as a sales culture and encourages a work hard, play hard type of attitude. In cases where both degree of risk and speed of feedback is low, we have what is known as a process culture. This is the case with several professional service firms, such as accounting firms, consulting firms, where they have pre-prescribed methods, processes, and procedures that they follow religiously. Medicine is an example of a process culture because although in medicine a patient might die, as long as they follow the right procedures, they are not at risk. With that, we end our first video of chapter 3. In the next video, we will pick up a discussion when we talk about the sphere of influence called professional cultures. Thank you.